"I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." The lonely rancher looked at her, then said, "You're hired, and you're home." New Mexico Territory, late summer of 1879. The sun was just starting to dip behind the dust-covered hills, casting long shadows across the plains. Wind stirred the red dirt on the road, lifting it into small swirls that danced over wagon ruts and dry grass. The heat had broken, but the air still clung to the skin like a worn-out coat. Owen Booker stood on the porch of his ranch house, boots planted firm, arms crossed, watching the wind settle. He had been fixing the hinges on the barn door when he heard it. A knock. Not loud, just enough to be certain. He turned. At the edge of his porch, standing as if she might collapse at any moment, was a girl. 19, maybe 20. Skinny as a fence rail, boots nearly soleless, a shawl so worn the fringe blew like spiderwebs in the breeze. In her hands, she clutched a cast-iron pot as if it were gold. She did not smile, she did not beg. Her voice cracked, but her eyes held steady. "I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook." Owen said nothing. He studied her, the way her lips were chapped, how her knees trembled but never buckled, how her hands were blistered, yet still gripped that pot like it was the last piece of her mother she had left. His brow furrowed. "Name?" "Ellie Mae," she said, soft as a prayer. He looked past her, down the trail. No wagon, no mule, nothing but dust and the setting sun. "You got folks?" She shook her head once. He looked down at her bare fingers holding the handle of the pot. The rim had soot baked into it, like it had seen more campfires than kitchens. For a long breath, nothing passed between them but silence and the creak of wood in the wind. Then he stepped aside. "You're hired," he said, then added with a quiet that sounded almost like surrender. "And you're home." Ellie's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but like someone laying down a weight they had carried too far. She stepped forward, boots barely making a sound on the wood. He did not take her hand. He did not ask more. She passed him, eyes scanning the porch, the door, the corners. She walked into the house like someone tiptoeing into memory. Inside, the place was clean but cold. Sparse furniture, no flowers. A kettle sat rusting on the back burner. The hearth was swept but untouched. She paused in the doorway, turning slightly. "Where should I sleep?" Owen pointed to the back room. "There's a cot. Sheets are clean, water's in the basin. Tomorrow we talk chores. Tonight, you eat." She nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Owen stood alone a while longer, the sun now half gone. He looked out across the ranch, dry fields, 2 cows, a chicken coop half collapsed, and silence that had lasted too many winters. Then he turned inside, shut the door behind him, and for the first time in a long time, didn't lock it. The scent of bread was always the first thing Ellie remembered about childhood, warm, thick, and rising through the cracks in the floorboards. Her father, George May, worked the ovens of Millstone Bakery before dawn, his hands always covered in flour and burns. Her mother, Lillian, stitched aprons and hummed songs in a language Ellie never learned the name of. No, never learned the name. They were poor, but they were together. Until the winter of '74, when her mother's cough turned bloody and the doctor said there was nothing to be done. Ellie was 14 when she watched her father press cold cloths to a forehead that no longer felt them. She buried her mother in a pauper's grave, with a wooden cross carved from her father's bread paddle. Then came the mine collapse 2 years later. George had taken a second job digging for coal to pay off debts from Lillian's medicine. They never found his legs. Ellie was 16 when she was alone. She tried to hold on to the bakery. She knew how to mix, how to knead, how to rise bread by smell, but women were not allowed business in those parts without a man's name. The landlord, a man named Cyrus Elwood, let her stay for a time, then began locking the back door and lingering too long when she bent over the hearth. She'd left one night with bruises under her collar and the cast-iron pot her mother had once used to stew blackberries. It was all she had. She walked east first, toward Haddon's Fork, thinking perhaps the church might help. But the Reverend's wife clutched her Bible when Ellie approached, and a boy at the general store shouted, "Ain't no husbands following that one." She begged in silence. She held out the pot. At the next town, she offered to cook for board. The innkeeper let her wash dishes. On the third night, he opened her door without knocking. She broke his nose with a ladle and ran before dawn. 3 towns, 4 days. Snow in the sleeves, blisters in the boots. She slept in haylofts, under wagons, once behind a blacksmith's forge where a drunk tossed his whiskey bottle at her for snoring. By the time she saw the wooden gate of a ranch at the edge of nowhere, her lips were split. Her belly had forgotten what warm food was. She stood outside the fence, one hand clinging to the cast-iron pot, the other pulling her shawl tight across her ribs. "I don't want your pity," she whispered to no one. "Just your fire." Then the world tilted sideways. She did not remember the fall. Only the dirt against her cheek, the sound of hooves, a voice gruff and distant. "Someone get water." When she woke, it was not to sunrise, it was to quiet, to warmth. The scent of oats boiling on a stove, a room with stone walls, a blanket that smelled of cedar, and a man with rough hands placing her pot beside the hearth like it was made of glass. He had not taken it. That was how Ellie Mae knew she had not been stolen from, only saved. And still, she kept one hand on that handle through the night, just in case. The door creaked as Owen opened it, revealing a room cloaked in shadow and dust. "You can stay here," he said simply, nodding toward the bed without meeting her eyes. His voice was steady, but the way he lingered at the threshold suggested the room meant more than the few words aloud. Ellie stepped inside, her bare feet brushing against the cool floorboards, worn smooth from years of quiet footsteps. The air carried the faintest trace of lavender, long faded but stubborn in its persistence. The bed stood neatly made in the corner, a hand-stitched quilt pulled taut across it, the edges untouched by recent sleep. A lace doily sat atop the nightstand, yellowed with time. A shelf on the wall held a wooden hairbrush, a cracked mirror, and a pair of embroidered gloves, stiff with age and stiff with memory. "This was hers?" Ellie asked softly, not to pry, just to confirm what the room already told her, the way a place can whisper loss without speaking at all. Owen gave the slightest nod, his eyes not leaving the doorframe. "My wife, Clara. Fever took her, spring of '74. Ellie lowered her eyes, her voice small. "I will keep it clean. I promise." He stood there for a breath longer, then turned without a word, and left her alone in the room where ghosts still lived. She stood in the silence for a long time, running her hand gently along the dresser's edge, careful not to shift anything. Dust clung to her fingertips. She walked to the window, its panes streaked with time, and pulled the curtain back just enough to let in a sliver of moonlight. Then, carefully, she folded her blanket on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure if she belonged, but grateful to not be outside. The next morning, Ellie opened the door and found a bundle of kindling and 2 fresh eggs resting on the bench just outside. No note, no knock, just there, like a silent offering from someone who did not know how to say welcome. She brought them inside and stepped into the kitchen, then stopped. It was colder than she expected. The hearth had long gone cold. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The stovetop wore a coat of soft gray ash, as though the last fire had died quietly one night and no one had the heart to wake it again. Pans rusted where hooks once held them proudly, their handles drooping like tired arms. She walked through it slowly, fingers brushing along the counters. There were knife marks on the wood where onions and apples had once been chopped. A tin of dried herbs, unopened, sat on a dusty shelf. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. Someone had loved this place, then left it behind. She rolled up her sleeves and tied back her hair, found a rag, boiled water, scrubbed the counters until the grain showed through again. She opened every window, letting in the pale morning. The wind was sharp, but it smelled clean. It felt like exhuming a memory. She found a chipped blue bowl tucked in the back of a cupboard, washed it twice, then cracked the eggs into it. Her hands shook, but the rhythm of whisking settled her. She added salt from a jar nearly full, chopped onions finely, and moved like someone who had always known how to work with fire and hunger. As the scent of eggs and heat began to fill the air, she reached up and rehung a sun-bleached curtain. A triangle of golden light spilled across the old wooden floor, catching on something tucked between 2 books. She leaned in. A photograph, worn and soft at the edges, barely clung to the frame. A woman with kind eyes and a boy smiling shyly beside her. Owen's wife, his son. Ellie stared at it for a long while, then bowed her head. "I'll take good care of it," she whispered. She was not sure if she meant the photograph, the house, or the silence that still clung to its bones. Maybe all 3. Later that day, the floor creaked softly as Owen stepped just inside the kitchen, his shadow stretching toward the hearth. He paused, sniffed the air, not intrusive, just curious. "You used the time," he said, more statement than question. Ellie, wiping flour from her apron, looked up. It was still good. He nodded once. Clara liked thyme in her eggs. She met his eyes. "Then I will keep using it." Owen left without another word, his boots thudding softly on the porch. That night, Ellie noticed the kindling by the stove was stacked a little higher, more carefully, and she stirred the stew a little longer, letting the warmth settle deep into the walls, and maybe into him. The snow had softened outside, the wind dying into a hush that let the ranch breathe again. Inside, the air warmed not just with fire, but with something unfamiliar, a scent that had not visited these walls in years. It was a scent of home. Chicken bones simmered gently, rosemary weaving its subtle promise through the rising steam, and the faint sweetness of fresh cornbread cooling by the hearth. Ellie stood by the stove, careful not to spill a drop, ladling chicken soup into a deep ceramic bowl that once belonged to Owen's wife. The broth shimmered golden in the lantern light, filled with tender carrot rounds, cubed potatoes, and a whisper of rosemary, not from any cookbook but embedded in her memory. It was a recipe passed down by her mother, learned by heart around crackling stoves, and shared lullabies that soothed a child to sleep. Beside the bowl, she placed a slice of cornbread, its edges browned just enough to break with a soft crunch. She ran her fingers over the crust, remembering the way her mother used to gently pat down the batter before baking, humming melodies that felt like sunlight itself. She carried the plate to the table and stepped back. Owen was already seated, his rough hands folded on his lap, eyes unreadable in the dim kitchen light. He watched the food with quiet intensity, as though tasting something far beyond flavor. Ellie offered a quiet nod, voice soft like the falling snow. "It is nothing fancy, just a farm meal." He did not reply. Instead, he reached for the spoon and dipped it into the soup. The room fell into a silence thicker than the steam. All she heard was the slow scrape of metal against ceramic, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, and the subtle crackle of the hearth fire, each moment stretching longer than the one before. She stood, stiffly, hands clasped in front of her, waiting, not for praise, but for permission to believe that this was enough. Owen finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down with deliberate care. He drew a breath, as if tasting the words before letting them out. "Cornbread's the kind that holds together," he said, voice low and measured. Ellie's shoulders eased as she nodded. "Cornmeal and lard, no eggs, Mama's trick when the hens wouldn't lay." He listened, eyes on the bowl, before shifting it toward her. "Good soup?" Her heart lifted, but her voice remained small. "Thank you." He rose then, putting his spoon back into the bowl, and stepped outside into the cold. The screen door slammed softly behind him. Ellie exhaled, shoulders slumping as the tension left her body. She turned back toward the sink, dragging the bowl behind her, still braced as though waiting for the moment he would change his mind. But she felt something settle instead, something like hope. Later that night, she made her way through the kitchen, a candle in hand and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. On impulse, she paused at the threshold, sensing rather than seeing. Owen stood by the window, barely moving. His figure was outlined against the dark pane, the faint reflection of the hearth fire behind him. His arms were folded across his chest, silent and steady. From where she stood, she could feel the weight of his gaze, not on the night sky, but on the kitchen itself. The pot still sat on the stove, its glow spilling into the darkness. The aroma of thyme lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. He did not see her standing there, but Ellie saw everything. The way his jaw was firm, the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little. This was not a man distrustful of her cooking or her hands. He was a man who had not let anything close in many years. A man who had built walls of silence, brick by careful brick, to shield himself from the world's betrayals. And now, she realized, he feared that to enjoy something simple, a hot bowl of soup, a warm slice of cornbread, a quiet kitchen filled with ordinary life, was to risk remembering what he had lost. She swallowed, eyes fixed on his reflection. She whispered into the gloom, words barely louder than a breath. "You can trust the small things, Owen, just the small things." Behind her, the fire did not die. It crackled gently, a promise that some warmth could return and that some losses could be healed, one quiet meal at a time. The night sky unfolded wide over the plains, stars pricking the velvet dark like someone had stitched light into the heavens. The wind was soft for once, curling around the porch like an old dog resting at their feet. Ellie sat on the top step, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, knees pulled up to her chest. Owen sat beside her, boots planted firm on the ground, hat tipped low to keep the chill off his ears. They had eaten supper in silence, roasted turnips, leftovers, stew, and slices of cornbread from the morning batch. Now they sat together, not talking, not needing to. The quiet was not awkward, it was full, the kind of silence that held space, like a blanket between them. After a while, Ellie broke it, her voice gentle. "My mama once burned a whole tray of biscuits," she said. "Left them in too long while telling me a story about how Papa asked her to marry him." Owen tilted his head, eyes still on the sky. "We didn't have much that day. She was so mad at herself, crying and cursing up a storm. But my papa just took one, said, 'Burned love still love, if it's warm,' and ate the whole thing." A quiet laugh escaped her lips. "I laughed so hard I near choked. Then Mama started laughing too. She always did get mad at herself more than anyone else." Owen's lips quirked at the corners. Then, barely, he chuckled, a soft, short sound, but real. It was the first time Ellie had heard him laugh. She turned slightly, stealing a glance. In the starlight his face looked gentler than usual, the shadows kinder. She did not say anything more, just let it sit there between them. When the night deepened and they stood to go inside, Owen paused by the door. "I'll fix the dining table tomorrow," he said. Ellie blinked. "Why?" He shrugged once, voice low. "You need space to roll dough. That old sideboard's too narrow." Ellie nodded, heart catching a little. "Thank you," she said. The next morning, before sunrise, she found him in the dining room, sleeves rolled up, sanding the edge of the long oak table. The surface had warped over the years, bent from heat and spills and time. He worked quietly, methodically, smoothing the wood with patient care. She stood in the doorway watching. "You do not need to," she said. He kept sanding. "You do not ask much, just seems right." That afternoon she baked again. This time it was sweet rolls, light, golden, brushed with honey. When she brought him one, he took it in his calloused hand and bit in without a word. But when he looked at her, just a moment, just a glance, she saw something had shifted. Not much, but something. A week later, she found a new rolling pin on the shelf. Not new, really, just newly carved, from oak, shaped by hand. It fit her grip perfectly. There was no note, no mention of it. But she knew. And she whispered into the flower that morning, "Some men love louder without words." And the dough rose just fine. The day had been long and dry. Ellie had spent the morning kneading bread and the afternoon hanging wet linens across the fence. The wind tugged them like restless hands, and she could feel a storm was building, though the sky stayed blue. By sundown, she was in the kitchen, dusting flour from her apron when the knock came. Not on the front door, on the side gate. 3 slow raps against the wooden post, then silence. Owen was still out in the pasture, checking the irrigation ditch. Ellie stepped out onto the porch cautiously, a rag in hand, her heart thudding like it always did when the world felt too quiet. A man stood at the gate, tall, lean, with a crooked smile that held no kindness. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Ain't this a surprise?" Ellie froze. His name was Silas. He had lived 2 rooms down from her in the boarding house back in Junction Hollow, one of the places she had fled through on her way west. He had never touched her, but he had looked, spoken too sweet, smelled like sweat and sour whiskey. He had offered her things she never asked for, then turned cruel when she refused. "I was just passing through," he said, stepping closer. "Saw the smoke from the chimney. Thought maybe someone here had a plate to spare. Didn't think I'd find you, of all people." Ellie gripped the rag tighter. "Thought you was gone for good," he said, eyes scanning the yard, the porch, the table behind her. "But look at this. Fresh laundry, porch flowers, and a clean dress. You must be doing all right for yourself." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "You still cooking? I remember that stew you made for the old widow on the 2nd floor. Smelled like Sunday supper." Silas leaned in slightly, his tone dropping lower. "Funny, you never said goodbye when you left. Thought we was friends." Ellie took a step back. And then, bootsteps, firm, purposeful. "Owen." He had returned from the pasture, silently, like the land itself had warned him. His shirt was damp with sweat, one glove half pulled off, his eyes locked on Silas. He did not speak for a moment, just moved to stand beside Ellie. Then he did something she would never forget. Without a word, he placed his hand gently on her shoulder. A small gesture, but it said everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "She works here. She belongs here." Silas blinked. The charm on his face flickered, then vanished. "Well, I didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered, backing up a step. "Just passing through." He tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, Miss Ellie." Then he turned and walked off into the dust. Ellie stood still, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and throat. Owen said nothing more. He did not tighten his grip, did not look down at her. Just kept his hand there for a few seconds longer, then let go and stepped back, giving her space. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said, voice shaking. "You do not owe me thanks," he replied. "A good cook deserves a safe kitchen." But his eyes said more than that. Later that night, after supper, Ellie stood by the window and watched the horizon, wondering if Silas had really gone, if he had said anything to anyone, if he would come back. Owen was in the workshop, sharpening tools. But when she walked into the kitchen the next morning, she found a fresh horseshoe hanging above the back door, a quiet ward, a signal of protection. And she knew, without needing to ask, that Owen had put it there. She touched the curve of the iron, then went to stoke the fire. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her. Without demand, without condition, just because she was there, just because she mattered. And that made all the difference. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, painting the wooden floor in ribbons of gold. Ellie stood barefoot by the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her fingers dusted with flour. The dough was ready, soft, rich with buttermilk and butter, and the old tin cutter waited by her side. Behind her, Owen lingered near the door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You said you never learned to bake," she said, without turning around. "I did not," he admitted. "Was always more skilled at burning things than browning them." She smiled and patted the dough. "Then today, we fix that." He hesitated, then stepped forward, awkwardly pulling up a chair beside her at the long table. Ellie guided him through each step, her voice calm and patient. "Cut, press, fold. Do not overwork it. Butter needs to stay cold." Owen listened closely, trying to follow her every motion, but his large hands were clumsy. One biscuit came out lopsided, another too thin. She laughed. Not cruel, not mocking, just warm. "That one looks like Kansas after the floods," she teased gently. He looked at it, tilted his head, and chuckled under his breath. "Still better than the last one." "Progress," she said, eyes gleaming. The oven warmed the room, and soon the scent of baking filled the air, rich, buttery, slightly sweet. It wrapped around them, like a memory of home. They sat side by side, as the biscuits browned, talking about nothing much. Ellie told him about her mother's old apron, how it had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. Owen told her about his first horse, a stubborn mare named June, who had refused to go anywhere without a carrot. "You still got that apron?" he asked, glancing at her quietly. Ellie looked down. "No. It was one of the things I had to leave behind." He nodded, said nothing more. When the biscuits were ready, she pulled them from the oven and placed them on a cloth to cool. Owen reached for one before it was cool, burning his fingers. "Hot," he muttered, jerking back. "Told you," she said, laughing again. He blew on the biscuit and tried again. This time, he managed to bite. His face changed, not dramatically, but enough. "It's good," he said, as if surprised. "Of course it is," she said with mock offense. "What'd you think? I've been feeding you all these weeks." He chewed a moment longer, then said, "This one's different." Ellie paused. "How so?" "It tastes like something new," he replied. "Not just food, like the start of something. I don't know." So she blushed and looked down at her hands. The next morning, Ellie came into the kitchen expecting the usual, firewood, eggs, maybe a small jar of preserves. But something else waited for her. A small bundle, wrapped in twine, sitting neatly at the center of the table. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a bunch of wildflowers, clover, sage, 2 early daisies, and something purple she did not recognize. No note. No name. Owen came in a minute later, his boots heavy on the floor. He did not say anything at first, just walked to the sink and washed his hands. Then, as he dried them, he nodded toward the flowers. "For the kitchen," he said simply. "That smells like life again." Ellie turned to him, her fingers brushing the petals. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then went back outside. Later that day, she found herself humming while she kneaded dough. The song was something her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. Ellie had not thought of it in years, but now it rose to her lips without effort. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn gold behind the hills. Neither said much, but Ellie noticed how Owen's arm rested just a little closer than before, how he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he exhaled like a man beginning to breathe again. In the fading light, she looked at him. "You ever think about what it means to stay?" she asked quietly. He tilted his head. "Meaning?" She shrugged. "Most people I've met, they run. Run from places, run from themselves, run from what they lost. But this place, it feels like staying might not be the same as being stuck." He looked at her for a long time. "I've been stuck before," he said. This don't feel like that." She smiled, soft and slow. "No, it don't." There were no grand declarations, no promises made under moonlight. Just the warmth of two people learning how to belong, in their own quiet way. And in that simple silence, surrounded by biscuits and wildflowers, a smile bloomed that neither had worn in years. Spring returned to the plains, gentle and full of color. The wildflowers came first, scattered tufts of purple and yellow across the ridge, and then the grass, green and forgiving after a long, wind-bitten winter. The ranch, once so quiet it felt haunted, now hummed with simple rhythm. Fences mended, soil tilled, biscuits rising before sunrise. The kitchen had changed the most. It was no longer just a place to eat, it was alive with conversation, laughter, and smells that made even the coldest mornings feel warm. Ellie Mae stood by the window, her hands still dusted with flour. She watched Owen across the yard, hammering a new beam into the porch rail. His shirt clung to his back, streaked with sweat and sawdust. She smiled faintly. Then, her smile faded. A letter sat folded on the table behind her. An offer. The mayor's wife from town had come by last week, tasted Ellie's peach cobbler, and said it was better than anything this side of Abilene. She had a storefront open, a small kitchen in need of a baker. A chance to start her own shop, her own name above the door. Ellie had never had that. Never had much of anything. And yet, she baked one last loaf before dusk, a golden-crusted sourdough, her mother's recipe. That evening, she found Owen on the porch, gazing out over the fields. She sat beside him, placed the loaf between them, and spoke quietly. "I was thinking I might go," she said. "Town's got a kitchen with my name waiting, stove that works, real customers." Owen nodded slowly. He looked at the loaf, then at her. "You should," he said, "if that's where your heart's leanin'." Ellie swallowed. "It's not about heart, it's about not missing what might be mine." "I understand." He stood and stepped off the porch, walking back into the house without another word. She sat there alone for a long time, the bread untouched, the night colder than it had been all week. The next morning, just after sunrise, Owen stood in the barn tying up bundles of rope, when he heard footsteps behind him. Ellie's voice came soft but certain. "I made it to the edge of town," she said. He turned. She stood there, still in her apron, a warm loaf tucked beneath one arm, a travel sack nowhere to be seen. "But when I saw the sun hit that ridge, I just couldn't go." Owen took a step toward her, eyes searching. "I'm not leaving," she continued, holding out the loaf. "Not unless you fire me." Owen looked at her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out something small, wrapped in an old cloth, worn thin from years of being kept close. He unfolded it. A silver ring, modest, scuffed with age, but clean, whole. He placed it in her flower-streaked hand. "Then you're not just hired," he said, voice low and rough. "You're home." Ellie blinked quickly. Her fingers closed around the ring. "I hope you like biscuits every day," she whispered. He smiled. "As long as they come with you." The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the ranch house, the old fence, the kitchen window with its patched curtains. Birds chirped in the distance. Somewhere a windmill creaked. Inside the kitchen the fire crackled. 2 mugs of coffee waited, and on the table beside them a single wildflower in a mason jar. It was not a grand proposal. There were no candles, no music, no lace. But it was love, as sure as anything ever was. Love in the shape of a warm loaf, a silver ring, a place by the fire, and a man who did not say much, but who had said enough. Because sometimes, your home is the only vow you need. If this story stirred something in your heart, the silence of a man's love, the strength of a woman's will, the warmth of a home built from nothing but kindness, then there are more tales waiting for you on this journey through the old American frontier. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more timeless romances born from dust, wind, and quiet devotion. Stories where words are few, but hearts speak volumes. Where love is not just felt, it's earned. Because, out here in the West, even the loneliest souls can find their way home, one firelight night at a time.